Leroy Hanlon is a man who's all about courage, loss, and encounters with Pennywise. Through his life, we see how ordinary people can rise to confront extraordinary evil and how the scars of those encounters echo across generations. In 1962, Major Hanlon was pretty much a horror genre rarity because he was someone who perceives Derry's evil and actively fights back at a time when most are blind to it. He faces down not only Pennywise's tricks, but also human hate like racism and violence with equal resolve. Leroy's fearlessness in the literal sense, courtesy of his war injury, is almost symbolic, and we think he represents a fearless moral fortitude as well. He knows what's right and refuses to be intimidated, whether it's by a bigot with a gun or a clown with ancient powers. This makes him a formidable adversary for it, who thrives on fear. Pennywise meets perhaps its first true challenge in Derry, not from an army or a demigod, but from one stout-hearted man who simply isn't afraid of it. However, Leroy's heroism isn't without heartbreak. By the end of his life, Leroy lost his friends and even those he truly loved, and in one way or another, Pennywise was involved. So, in this video, we're going to explore Major Leroy Hanlon's entire life, but before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those two small clicks will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. With that out of the way, let's begin. Early life and military background. Leroy Hanlon was born in the early 20th century, around 1916, and came of age in a segregated America. By the 1950s, he had begun a career in the United States Air Force. A veteran of the Korean War, Leroy attained the rank of major. His military service left a profound mark on him in ways both visible and unseen. Not only was he a skilled pilot and a disciplined officer, he also carried a unique war wound in the form of a brain injury sustained in combat that mysteriously robbed him of the ability to feel fear. This absence of fear would later prove to be a double-edged sword in the strange town of Derry, Maine. By 1962, Major Leroy Hanlon's reputation and skills brought him a new assignment. He was recruited by General Francis Shaw for a special mission in Derry. Believing this post could offer stability for his family, Leroy uprooted his life and moved north. He arrived in Derry with his wife, Charlotte Hanlon, and their young son, Will. At 46 years, Leroy was a confident and by-the-book officer stepping into a town on the brink of historic horror. Unbeknownst to him, Derry's dark cycle of terror was awakening just as the Hanlons settled in. The Hanlons arrive in Derry, 1962. Coming to 1960s Derry, Leroy immediately encountered the twin challenges of the era. That is, social prejudice and something even more sinister lurking beneath the town's surface. On his first day at the Derry Air Force Base, Major Hanlon faced open racism from a subordinate, Sergeant Masters. Leroy's response was calm professionalism. Before the confrontation could escalate, General Shaw intervened to welcome him. This incident set the tone for Leroy's initial days in Derry, like one of those opening scenes in a Shakespearean play. You see, he was a black officer in a tense time, determined to do his duty despite the ignorance around him. Charlotte, his wife, similarly found Derry far from welcoming. A principled social activist, Charlotte wasn't one to stay silent when faced with injustice. In a town steeped in the prejudices of the 1960s, she stood up against bullying and bigotry, earning disapproval from many. Leroy, however, urged caution. He loved Charlotte's courage, but as a man used to military order, he initially preferred to keep his head down and play by the rules for the sake of his family's safety. This gentle clash in outlook, that of Leroy working for the man and Charlotte pushing against the establishment, created a dynamic yet loving partnership amid Derry's mounting horrors. Leroy's mission in Derry was ostensibly a routine one. He was enlisted by General Shaw to pilot a new B-52 bomber for a top-secret project. The real purpose of that project would soon become clear. One night, not long after moving into their new home, Leroy was ambushed by masked men demanding the schematics for the B-52 G-class bomber he'd been tasked to fly. Major Hanlon's combat instincts kicked in and he refused to submit, fighting back instead, and, with the timely help of his friend Captain Paulie Russo, he managed to fend off the intruders. The attack was as bizarre as it was alarming, because the assailants, you see, wielded an unusual Soviet-made pistol and seemed more interested in terrorizing Leroy than in any military plans. When one of his own men, Sergeant Masters, later confessed to being involved, Leroy's sharp mind sensed something was off. Confronting the arrested sergeant in the stockade, Leroy made it clear, even to Masters, that he lacked the weapon's expertise to have been the gunman. Near as I can tell, you can barely strip down an M16, much less handle a Soviet pistol like you're married to it, Leroy tells him. He concludes the hateful sergeant had been framed or willfully accepted committing a crime he didn't commit. Taking this to General Shaw, Leroy learns the truth. The attack was in fact an orchestrated test of Leroy's mettle. Shaw reveals that he needed an officer with an extraordinary quality for a top-secret initiative, and Leroy's special relationship with fear made him the perfect candidate. It turns out that Leroy's war injury, which left him physiologically fearless, was exactly what Shaw was looking for. Deep beneath Derry, something ancient and evil was lurking, an entity that feeds on fear and had haunted the town for centuries. Shaw had assembled a covert team to investigate this, essentially recruiting Leroy to help hunt a monster. Leroy is skeptical at first, but the general isn't asking him to take it on faith alone. He introduces Leroy to Dick Halloran, a man with psychic shining abilities. Stephen King fans will recognize Halloran as the same Dick Halloran who survives the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, but here, in 1962, he's a younger man using his gifts to help the military in Derry. Leroy is then briefed on a secret mission to locate a mysterious weapon buried near Derry, in reality, the shape-shifting creature known as It, or Pennywise, that awakens every few decades to wreak havoc. Encountering the supernatural in Welcome to Derry. With his fearlessness now a prized asset, Major Hanlon plunges into a shadowy operation that's equal parts military protocol and paranormal terror. In one early operation, Leroy pilots a helicopter over the forests outside Derry, with Dick Halloran aboard acting as a psychic compass to sense its presence. The flight turns perilous when the evil lurking in Derry reaches out through Halloran's mind. Dick falls into a trance mid-flight, mesmerized by its influence, and suddenly moves to open the chopper's door, ready to hurl himself out. Leroy lunges and grabs Halloran in time, saving the psychic from a fatal fall. It's a terrifying moment that confirms what Leroy had only been told, that something unearthly and malevolent is truly out there. After this incident, Leroy's wariness of his new colleagues grows. He hasn't forgotten the masked attack from before, and he suspects Dick Halloran was one of those masquerading assailants, using his telepathy to probe Leroy's mind during the staged test. That evening, Leroy invites Dick to his home for dinner with Charlotte, using the occasion to confront him discreetly. Going outside, Leroy drops all pretense. He reveals that he knows Dick had pried into his thoughts that night. "Stay out of my head. Are we clear?" Leroy warns, his voice calm but firm. Halloran admits to it, saying that when he looked into Leroy's mind during the attack, he found something astonishing. Instead of terror, Leroy's thoughts were coolly figuring the situation out. Dick had seen into many minds racked with fear and final thoughts, but Leroy's mind was unique. The normal spark of fear was absent. Halloran even admits he'd be glad to have someone as fearless as Leroy beside him in the trenches against whatever evil lies ahead. As the series progresses, Leroy transitions from skeptic to believer. At first, he tries to shield his family from disturbing talk. Young Will, now about 12 years old, becomes entangled in Derry's eerie occurrences. Will and a small group of misfit friends, a kind of 1962 losers club, witness supernatural events like apparitions, ghostly photographs, and hints of a murderous clown stalking children. Leroy, ever the practical father, is reluctant to accept his son's stories of ghosts at face value, focusing instead on tangible dangers like the racially charged injustice unfolding in town because one of Will's friend's fathers has been wrongfully accused of murder, which stirs Charlotte's activism. But Pennywise has a way of making even the staunchest doubters see the truth. In a bid to bond with his son and perhaps calm his nerves, Leroy takes Will on a fishing trip outside of town. What starts as a peaceful father-son outing turns into a nightmare. Pennywise targets Will in broad daylight, manifesting as a horror vision. Leroy's own corpse, burned and charred from a plane crash that hasn't actually happened, at least not yet. Imagine the shock for Will. One moment he's fishing with his dad, the next he's face to face with the grotesque image of his father's burnt body, reanimated by a demonic clown. The apparition grabs Will and drags him under the water, snarling a chilling prophecy. "You'll burn too." As Will struggles for his life, Leroy manages to pull his son out of the water, but the damage is done. Will is left visibly scarred, physically and emotionally, by the encounter. For Leroy too, this incident is the turning point. Recovering on shore, he finds nothing but a single red balloon bobbing on the breeze, the calling card of It. In that instant, any doubts he harbored about Derry's supernatural cause evaporate. The fearless Major Hanlon is furious and alarmed, not for himself but for his family. The monster they're dealing with just made it personal. Leroy storms into General Shaw's office demanding the full truth that even Dick couldn't provide. Rather than give a lecture, Shaw opts to show Leroy what they're really up against. He allows Leroy to watch a classified psychic session in which Halloran probes the ancestral memories of a local Native American man. In an eye-opening sequence, Leroy is shown Derry's grim history and learns how an otherworldly being arrived in ancient times, how the indigenous people tried to contain it, and how generations of Derry's residents, ignorant or in denial, fell prey to its evil. This download of knowledge finally equips Leroy with the understanding that Derry is effectively a prison built around an eldritch monster, one that feeds on fear and periodically escapes to feast on the innocent. From this point forward, Leroy Hanlon becomes one of the few adults in 1962 Derry who not only knows about the evil stalking the town, but is willing to confront it. He now understands that the disturbing events, the child murders, the unjust accusations, the pervasive dread, these are all connected to this entity stirring in Derry's shadows. Leroy's fearlessness, once just a medical quirk, now makes him uniquely suited to face an enemy that literally thrives on terror. However, even without the feeling of fear, Leroy isn't reckless. He's a man who loves his family above all. His priority becomes protecting Charlotte and Will while helping to stop the evil.
Now they live down here with the crowd!
The Black Spot Fire and Family Tragedy. All roads in Welcome to Derry lead to one single event that will go down in history as the darkest chapter in Derry's past, and it's called the Burning of the Black Spot. As Leroy and his allies pursue Pennywise, Derry's simmering racial tensions reach a boiling point at a nightclub known as the Black Spot. In Stephen King's book, the Black Spot was a speakeasy established by black servicemen near the Derry base, a safe haven where black soldiers could relax given that segregation barred them from the whites-only officers' clubs back in the 1930s. The HBO series updates this to the 1960s but keeps the core tragedy intact. In It, Welcome to Derry, the Black Spot is depicted as a decommissioned Air Force storage facility turned nightclub founded by Dick Halloran and others as a refuge from the town's prejudice. This inclusive oasis becomes a target for Derry's worst elements. In 1962, amid the real-world backdrop of the civil rights movement, a masked white supremacist group called the Maine Legion of White Decency strikes. They trap the club's patrons inside and set the Black Spot ablaze, intent on turning a night of music and camaraderie into a death trap. Leroy Hanlon's role on that fateful night has yet to fully unfold on screen, but all signs point to him being at the center of it. As an Air Force officer and a friend of Halloran, Leroy would likely be present or nearby when the fire breaks out. Furthermore, the kids are already at the Black Spot, and the crazy, bloodthirsty white dudes have arrived here at the end of the 6th episode. King's novel described how survivors of the 1930 Black Spot fire, most importantly, a young Will Hanlon in that timeline, saw a giant, monstrous bird carrying red balloons swooping amidst the flames. And this was supposed to be a manifestation of Pennywise reveling in the carnage. For the Hanlon family, the Black Spot Fire is more than a historical tragedy. It's the night their lives change forever. Charlotte Hanlon's fate remains uncertain as the series builds to this climax. Charlotte isn't mentioned as being alive in the It film era of 1989, which means that something tragic may befall her by the end of 1962. It's very possible that Charlotte, ever the brave soul, is present at the Black Spot when the Legion attacks, perhaps coming over to meet Hank or to save her son. It's because of this that she could become a victim of the flames of Pennywise's terror. Leroy and Will, however, are both known to survive this night, albeit scarred in their own ways. If Welcome to Derry follows through on the vision Pennywise gave young Will, that "you'll burn too" prophecy, it may be that Will witnesses his father Leroy nearly perish while trying to help during the crisis. We do know from the series' backstory that Leroy's greatest asset, his fearlessness, could also be a blind spot. He might take risks no one else would precisely because he doesn't feel fear. It's not hard to imagine Leroy rushing into danger during the Black Spot fire to save lives or confront Pennywise directly. Whether or not a plane is involved, the show's episode recap already showed Pennywise exploiting the idea of Leroy burning to death, indicating that this threat looms large in Will's mind. In Stephen King's novel It, Mike Hanlon's father, Will Hanlon, survived the 1930 Black Spot fire, saved by none other than Dick Halloran, who dragged him out of the flames. Welcome to Derry appears to transfer that survivor's mantle to Leroy and young Will in 1962. We can expect Dick Halloran and Leroy to be pivotal in rescuing whomever they can from the blaze, possibly strengthening their bond through shared trauma. The tragedy will not be without cost. It's almost a certainty that Leroy loses people he cares about at the Black Spot, and Derry's cycle of hate and fear claims many lives. By the end of that long night, Leroy will have stared into the very heart of Pennywise's darkness and lived. It's a safe bet that this experience, combined with the earlier supernatural encounters, leaves Leroy a changed man. Later years. Raising Mike Hanlon, 1970s to 1989. After the horrors of 1962, Leroy Hanlon remained in Derry, a town he now knew was cursed in more ways than one. In the years following the Black Spot Fire, Leroy likely retired from the Air Force and tried to rebuild a normal life. He turned to a humble profession on Derry's outskirts, sheep farming. By the late 70s, Leroy had become a grandfather, and his son Will grew up and started a family of his own. Will Hanlon married Jessica, and together they had a baby boy in the mid-1970s, Mike Hanlon, named for Leroy's beloved father, Michael, in some continuities. Tragically, the Hanlon family's brush with fire wasn't over. Sometime around 1980, when Mike was just a little boy, Will and Jessica Hanlon died in a house fire, leaving Mike orphan. In It, Chapter 1 from 2017, it's mentioned obliquely that Mike's parents died in a blaze. Chapter 2 from 2019 even hints that they might have struggled with addiction and perished in an accidental fire related to that. However, Welcome to Derry is poised to clarify or reframe this part of the story. The series strongly implies that Will's death ties back to its legacy of flames. King's novel had Will survive the black spot, only to eventually die in another fire years later, which seems to be mirrored in the Hanlon family history on screen. In fact, the Welcome to Derry canon explicitly notes that when Pennywise, in 1962, taunted young Will by taking Leroy's shape and saying, "You'll burn too," that nightmare ultimately came true. Will did burn to death, albeit a couple of decades later. This loss hit Leroy pretty badly. He had faced down unimaginable evil and rampant bigotry without flinching, but the death of his only son was a blow no man could weather without scars. By 1989, when It 2017 is set, Leroy Hanlon was in his early 70s and one of the last of his generation still living in Derry. He had become the sole guardian of 13-year-old Mike Hanlon and was determined to raise the boy with the toughness and vigilance he believed was necessary to survive in their town. We meet Leroy in this movie as a grizzled, no-nonsense grandfather who runs a farm and expects young Mike to pull his weight. In one scene, Mike hesitates to use a captive bolt pistol to put down a sheep at the slaughterhouse. Leroy swiftly intervenes, snatching the bolt gun and dispatching the animal himself, then dressing down Mike for his hesitation. "Look at me, son," Leroy says firmly to his grandson. "There are two places you can be in this world. You can be out here like us, or you can be in there like them." He gestures toward the penned sheep, driving home his point. "You waste time hemming and hawing, and someone else is going to make that choice for you. Except you won't know it until you feel that bolt between your eyes." To young Mike and the outside world, Leroy might seem cold or even cruel in these moments, but understanding Leroy's past sheds light on his demeanor. The older Leroy appears much more bitter and mean than the optimistic Major we see in 1962, but by that point, he had survived Pennywise and the loss of a son, which explains quite a lot about his attitude as a senior citizen. Leroy's tough love approach was born from knowing just how dangerous Derry truly was. In private, he had shared with Mike what most adults wouldn't dare utter. Derry was cursed, and an evil thing was behind its every tragedy. Mike recalls in the film that his grandfather believes all the bad things in town happened because of one sinister force feeding on Derry's people. This kernel of truth, planted by Leroy, is crucial. When Mike eventually joins the Losers Club of Misfit Kids, he carries his grandfather's warnings with him. It's Leroy's eerie local legends that help convince the others that Pennywise is real. In this movie, while Ben Hanscom provides library research about Derry's history, Mike provided lived knowledge when he says, and we quote, "My grandfather thinks this town is cursed, that all the bad things that happen in this town are because of one thing, an evil thing." This dovetails exactly with what Leroy experienced firsthand in 1962. In a sense, Leroy Hanlon's vigilance and refusal to forget Derry's past directly enables the losers to piece together the truth in 1989. Unlike most Derry adults who live in denial, or literally forget under its influence, Leroy remembered, and he passed that knowledge down to Mike. Leroy's presence in 2019's It Chapter 2 is minimal. By the time the losers reunite as adults in 2016, Leroy has already passed away. He He would have been 100 years old by then after all. In the film's expanded lore, there's an implication that Leroy died sometime in the late 90s, well after Mike was grown, but long before Pennywise rose again. We briefly see a newspaper clipping in Chapter 2 referencing the old fire at the Black Spot, a callback to the tragedy Leroy survived. There's also a reference that suggests Leroy's slaughterhouse, or the place Mike does deliveries for him, was once the site of the Black Spot, a continuity detail the series has since clarified differently. Though Leroy is absent in the flesh during the adult losers' battle, his impact lingers. Mike, now the librarian and keeper of Derry's memories, carries on his grandfather's mission to uncover the truth and stop it for good. In many ways, Leroy's legacy is that of the unsung hero. He fought the good fight in 1962, ensured the next generation knew what they were up against, and hardened Mike into someone who wouldn't run from Derry's darkness. Adapting Leroy Hanlon from King's novel to the screen. It's fascinating to compare Leroy Hanlon's story in Welcome to Derry and the films with the original Stephen King novel, because Leroy, as we know him, is largely a creation of the adaptations. In King's 1986 novel, It was actually Mike's father, Will Hanlon, who had the prominent backstory involving the Derry military base and the Black Spot nightclub fire. The novel's interlude chapters recount how Will, as a young Black Army private in the 30s, was stationed at Derry's base and experienced the Black Spot tragedy firsthand, even catching a glimpse of it in the form of that monstrous bird amidst the flames. He later told these stories to Mike, giving the Losers Club crucial insight into Derry's past. The filmmakers of the It movies and the Welcome to Derry show chose to shift this timeline and redistribute roles for both practical and creative reasons. In the film continuity, the loser's childhood is set in 1989 instead of the late 50s. That means the previous cycle of its terror gets moved up from 1930 to 1962 to maintain the roughly 27-year pattern. Rather than have Mike's father be the one involved in the 1962 events, which would make Mike a child in the 60s, not the 80s, the story introduces Mike's grandfather as the key witness of that era. Essentially, Leroy Hanlon replaces Will Hanlon's role from the novel's backstory, allowing the Hanlon family to still be intimately connected to Derry's darkest chapter while keeping Mike's birth generation in the 1970s. Director Andy Muschietti and producer Barbara Muschietti have explained that they fused characters and created a compelling situation, taking the essence of Will Hanlon's Black Spot experience and grafting it onto Leroy in the 1960s setting. The result is seamless on screen. Leroy, as a Korean War vet in '62, lines up with Will as a World War II-era soldier in the 30s, and it enriches the Hanlon family story across generations. There are other changes too. In King's novel, Will Hanlon didn't have the supernatural condition of being fearless. That detail appears to be a fresh invention for Leroy's character in the show. By giving Leroy a war injury that removed his ability to feel fear, the show ramps up the stakes. It poses interesting questions about what Pennywise, who exploits fear, would do against a man that lacks that emotion. This also adds a bit of comic book flair to Leroy's otherwise grounded heroism, making him stand out in a largely civilian ensemble. Another notable adaptation tweak involves Dick Halloran. The novel had Dick simply as a cook who survived the Black Spot, whereas Welcome to Derry makes him an active participant in hunting It, a military consultant with psychic powers. This change weaves The Shining's lore directly into It, expanding King's universe on screen and giving Leroy a powerful ally and occasional adversary in his story. The fate of Mike's parents differs between book and film/series continuities, which in turn affects Leroy's role. In the novel, Will Hanlon survives into Mike's adulthood, albeit ill by 1985, and Mike's mother also lives. There's no orphaning of Mike as a child. The films chose a dramatically different path. They killed off Mike's parents during his childhood in a fire, and thus positioned Leroy as Mike's surrogate parent. This not only heightens Mike's sense of isolation, making him the only loser without a traditional family, but it also brings Leroy into the spotlight in 1989. As noted earlier, It Chapter 2 implies that Mike's parents died due to a drug lab explosion or a related mishap, whereas the series is aligning more with King's themes by tying the Hanlon family tragedy back to the Black Spot/its influence. We see a newspaper clipping in the second film that alludes to the Black Spot fire happening in 1962, and Mike has a vision of burning hands at his grandfather's slaughterhouse door. These were little Easter eggs in the film, but Welcome to Derry picks them up and runs with them, making the Black Spot fire a central event. In fact, The HBO series corrects a small continuity hiccup. Chapter 2 showed the black spot location as the downtown meatpacking plant where Mike did deliveries for Leroy, but the show places the black spot at an abandoned airfield hangar outside of town. Fans can rationalize this as Pennywise muddling Mike's vision or simply a cinematic liberty, but it's clear the series aimed for historical and geographical accuracy in Derry's lore. Ultimately, these adaptation choices stem from a desire to tell a cohesive story within the Muschetti's It film universe. They recognize Mike Hanlon as the keeper of Derry's history, the bookkeeper, as Andy Muschietti calls him, and thus expanded the Hanlon family's backstory to give that history weight. "We owed it to the Hanlons to tell their story," Muschietti said. By introducing Leroy Hanlon as a major character in Welcome to Derry, the show pays homage to King's interludes but also adds fresh layers, exploring a black family's struggles and resilience in 1960s America within a horror narrative. This creative approach has been widely praised for enriching the franchise. Leroy's character, in particular, has been highlighted as one of the significant new leads of the prequel, portrayed with warmth and gravitas by actor Jovan Adepo. Adepo drew inspiration from his own father's Air Force background and his Southern upbringing to embody Leroy's mix of strictness and love. He describes young Leroy as very compelling, very brave, very family-oriented, loving, yet a product of the 60s who isn't outwardly expressive. This nuance makes Leroy feel like a real person shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Marvelous verdict! Leroy Hanlon is one of the strongest It characters ever. In terms of portrayal, Jovan Adepo's performance as young Leroy has been widely praised for capturing the essence of a hero who's both gentle and unyielding. Adepo had the unique challenge of channeling a character originally played by Stephen Williams in a brief movie role and fleshing him out decades earlier. A fun bit of trivia is that Stephen Williams, the elder Leroy, had previously played Jovan Adepo's grandfather in another TV project, so Adepo saw it as a weird coincidence and an honor to step into those shoes. Through Adepo, we see Leroy's warmth with his family, his sharp sense of humor in banter with Charlotte, and the steel in his spine when faced with danger. One moment he's playfully lifting his son onto his shoulders, and the next he's staring down a nightmare without blinking. It's a human, relatable depiction, far from a one-note action hero. By the end of Welcome to Derry's first season, Leroy Hanlon stands as a fully realized character in the Stephen King universe, one whose story enhances the meaning of the battles to come. He symbolizes the idea that bravery isn't the absence of fear, but the will to act and protect in spite of the horrors. In Leroy's rare case, it literally is the absence of fear, but he uses that gift to the fullest. His influence carries forward, and Mike Hanlon grows up to be the custodian of Derry's lore and the linchpin that brings the losers back to fulfill their oath. If not for Grandpa Leroy's teachings and survivalist upbringing, Mike might not have stayed in Derry or had the courage to call his friends back to finish it off. In conclusion, Leroy Hanlon's entire life, from war hero to Welcome to Derry protagonist to the gruff grandfather in It, speaks volumes about his resilience. He lived through the worst Derry could throw at him and still cared enough to fight for its future. The creators of this show recognize this, which is why Andy Muschietti said they owed the Hanlon family this spotlight. Leroy's arc enriches the It franchise by adding depth, historical scope, and emotional stakes that resonate beyond cheap scares. For fans, Leroy Hanlon has evolved from a minor figure glimpsed in the 2017 film into a bona fide horror hero in his own right. In the end, the fearless major from 1962 leaves behind a legacy of knowledge, courage, and hope, one that lights the way for those who come after him, the cursed town of Derry.